No, but
alive and
it should go live
kicking,
now.
kicking.
Not 7 minutes. I don't want to wait 7 minutes.
Alive and kicking.
Oh, what was the name of that band?
Simple
Simple
Minds.
Minds. All right, Dario, ready? Go live on YouTube. I put it in. I thought I went live, but it didn't publish. Try to publish now. Well, I guess we're gonna go live both on YouTube and. That's a good tobacco.
150 pesos for.
Like Chapas tobacco.
You should sell it here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Where?
2 shops besides Now Sushi.
Oh, I know those guys. They have like
They sell
different.
Huichol art.
Yeah, Huichol art.
Yeah.
Yeah. They came here once.
I mean, it's not the cheapest, but you don't have to go all the way back to Chiapas.
That saves the money on the bus ride.
Yeah, it does.
A
And,
little bit of time.
logistics.
Yeah.
Very tasty.
Let's put some water. Maybe the desk is too empty, or
No, it's perfect.
no, it's all set. You just need to make. Why am I hearing myself? I'm hearing myself. Oh yeah,
You're talking to yourself.
that's what the problem is. Trying to find myself.
Hear voices.
Fuck, I'm schizophrenic.
Within.
Shit. Yeah,
We all are
Chido?
sometimes.
On the web, yeah. All right. So this is a test of your broadcast system. Do not turn away from the television. There'll be a small beep after the thing, and then we will tell you about the Martians that have landed in Quintana Roo.
Which
Storm?
Oh.
Huh?
I was just dumbing people down kind of
Yeah.
identity.
You know why UFO exists, right? So the FBI were
Yes.
doing tests on all these around that Area 51, of all these new planes. So they sent out FBI agents dressed up as regular people and befriended other people and said, "Did you see that thing last night?" And everybody started saying, "Oh yeah, I saw that." And that's how UFOs came into being. I mean, not to say there is an alien life form. It would be silly to think that there is no other
But they're
alien.
not flying saucers.
Yeah, exactly. Are we ready? Are we live?
Y mi voz sí se oye. ¿Así o acá? Pegadito.
Is it published?
Sin albur.
All right, here we go. All right, welcome, Radio Tulum Nation. Wait, are we recording on that camera too? All right. Identity Podcast Season 1, Episode 9, I believe. Welcome, Radio Tulum Nation. We are very, very excited to have my close friend Juan Carlos Guerra sitting next to me, our resident sociologist, multifunctional artist, and just an all-around great human person. And as you know, we have been having a series on identity with Juan Carlos Guerra, and this is no exception. So we're going to be closing out the Identity Season 1 series this evening. So we have a 2-episode live show for you. And the first episode, we're going to concentrate, since I've been contending a lot of my own personal space, time, identity, and trying to figure out, I wonder if I'm at the multiple, I'm at the multiple of 7. I'm 49 years old, so it is exactly the time that we regenerate every 7 years. So I'm trying to figure out on a personal way. But before we get to that, how are you, Juan Carlos?
I hope you are at that stage. Yeah, man, it's been time.
Well, I mean, I think speaking about you saw the series Seven and Up.
No, I didn't.
No, there's a series. There's a filmmaker who started filming these kids at 7, and he's been filming them every year. Do you want me to take that off?
No, that's perfect.
Okay. He's been filming the kids from 7 all the way up to now 56, I believe. So it's a pretty great look at, the time of a human's life, which I always think that's how you define life. So, let's touch base about identity. And I've been contending, I'm an Indian person, and you and I sat down the other day and said, okay, well, let's dwell deeper into the sense of identity, almost to the soul level, the difference between Western and Eastern identity at those levels. So let's start there. What is the difference? Is there a difference in an Eastern and a Western identity?
Well, in the sense of self before identity, which is the basis for the latter.
So sense of self. That's a really good topic.
Yes,
I guess that's what
we identify
we'll call
with.
this episode
Yes.
sense of self. Okay.
Thing is, the basis of identity is what we identify with. So nowadays we understand identity in political senses, social,
Technological.
collective, yes, religious affiliation. But this is today. We are now in modernity or post-modernity.
Neo-postmodernity.
Yes, post, but for thousands of years, centuries, we were sons of God in the West.
Yeah.
We are individual souls, creations of Creator God, in like resembling what Christ did.
Well, that's AD. But I think if we went back even further, we had an interesting topic. I mean, the ancients of any civilization would tell you, prior to even the Greek gods and the myths of the gods, that chaos and creation were the same thing. Like there was a sense of identity, I would imagine, with the ancients, even the ancient people that lived in Mexico, or the Indian race or the Persian race. What do you think their sense of identity was wrapped up?
Mythology was...
pre-mythology, I would imagine,
Well, pre-mythology was an identification with the land you were domesticating.
Right, that's an interesting topic. What is that music that I keep hearing, guys?
It's fine.
Anyway, I think that we're trying to edit while we do this show, so we got the music going on underneath. Teotihuacan, there's a Japanese man who's been studying Teotihuacan, and he proposed that the first pyramid was built by one guy who came and saw this land and thought it fertile, and said, okay, how can I tell when to harvest and when to plant? And so he built this little pyramid. I think it was the Moon Pyramid, which would now turn into a huge pyramid, but it was much smaller. And then all these people came and saw this great sculpture. First of all, they were impressed just because they probably had never seen something like this, and then started to identify with it and gather around it because of its practical nature, and became a civilization which would eventually then bring in the kings, who would then formulate.
Yeah, well, it was a material projection of the lunar calendar, which was being used before the establishment of this physical structure, celebrating the power of clergy, astronomical clergy, who were aiding the state.
Do you think it was it was really that deep, or was it just a simple, I mean, I think pre-civilization, I think he was trying to give an example of how even civilization was formed. And civilization, in this instance, he's suggesting, was formed around this piece of rock. because it was practical to be able to plant and have a landmass.
It's also a symbolic representation of power, because the people who build it are part of a structure which is constructed by social relations of either warriors or chieftains or clergy. So that gives the people an idea of what they belong to and who they need to follow in the cultural sense. But much before, much earlier than that, what you had is that the transition from the before agriculture, we were recollecting hunters and gatherers. It was difficult to have a sense of identity when you didn't have survival assured.
Right. That you were could die at any minute.
You could die at any minute, so you needed surplus of food, and because of that, it was difficult to establish an identity. So even though we have cave art, say from 100,000 years before Christ, up to now, that stage, they were just projecting. Humans were projecting their anxieties and what they were living through, which was animals, and how that structured whatever sense of collective self there was. But you didn't have an identity which was linked to the land, because land was not important per se before agriculture. So once you have agriculture, you can now project how much food you're gonna need and require for the amount of people that are around you. So there's a combination of having plants and animals being harnessed by the power of tribes 10,000 years ago.
So we went from 100,000 years. I think the Venus of Willendorf comes in at 25,000
Yes.
years.
Transitional.
Yeah, that's the transitional forming and sculpturing. I mean, like forming the human body. That's an interesting facet. I think Wim Wenders did a documentary about the oldest caves, hieroglyphics found, and I think that they even mentioned that the reason why hieroglyphics existed in that space, it was because of the echo was the best inside that cave. Where in that point where
Lascaux in France?
Yeah, that one. Yeah, where the echo at that in that particular space. So when they first heard their own echo, it could be almost like that Freudian thing where he says when the child first sees himself in a mirror, there's a division between himself and the conceptual self, the self of the image.
Well, the voice and the perceiver.
Yeah, and I think that might be and it's very, very fascinating because it also goes back because I've been contending personally with is the soul this energy, since I am of India and one of those ancient which is really believes in chaos and creation being the same thing, which is a little bit different than the good and evil of the Western world. But I've gone to the Catholic school and gotten the guilt as well. So, strangely enough, I've been contending with: are we born and the Janam Patris and people who could read these time frames? Or do you think that there is an identity to the soul? Like, is there a separate? Are we like the butterfly wings or the snowflake, or is there an individual identity?
Well, leaving the West aside, because as I told you, yes, there's pre-Christian beliefs, but today we're mostly Christian or culturally based. It's a dualistic. God creates the individual selves that have an individual soul that have to die, and when they die, they go back to heaven to meet the Creator.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could go back to the Western is the philosophical Greeks. You could go back to Socrates. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, which are the basis of this sort of identifying. I mean, then of course you change it to Rome and Christ, and it changes all that stuff. But yeah, go back to let's leave out the Western. Let's go back to the Eastern.
Well, in the Eastern, I mean mainly India, where all started.
Yeah, India's given everything
Yes.
to. Yeah.
I mean, there's no consensus, but technically we are part of the spirit in the
In the Hindu.
in the mystical
In the mystical.
Upanishadic sense,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which was a reformation of the Vedas, which was more dualistic.
Yeah, the Vedas. I mean, a lot of things. I mean, I told you that the first play that I did, I kind of killed Krishna, and you said, "Hold on, brother."
Well, Krishna would be the most dualistic senses.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
But the basis, spiritual basis, the mystical basis is we are like drops from the ocean.
And those individual drops make an ocean. Therefore, the ocean is
no,
the
no,
collective.
the ocean includes the everlasting spirit.
So
And
there's
we're-
a larger spirit that we're a part of.
yes,
Is what
it's
you're
called
saying.
Brahman, and we're Atmans. We are
Well, the Atman is the grand Atman, right? The
Yes.
Atman is the Atman, and that I think Herman Hesse describes it great in Siddhartha, where he must go find his Atman. Or where does Atman live? And that could be possibly our consciousness identity.
well in this sense that you're referring to. Moksha is the liberation of the confused sense of identity, which is basically the what we will call the ego in the West.
Right. That is what somebody. I just watched a Steve Jobs documentary, and she said he had reached enlightenment, but in a moksha sense, where he didn't lose his ego, but
No,
gained enlightenment all at the same time.
well, you don't lose the ego in any sense. What you gain is an understanding of the ego as one of the parts that compose you. And the big difference with this mystical way of looking at fragments that we are is that you have a whole lifetime to realize the illusion you're in, samsara and maya. So you have stages suggested to you to follow, and technically you can reach enlightenment, which means just realizing that you're not the projected self that you're
the mirror
born
self,
into,
the
mi-
reflection
the mirror
self.
self, which you are born into as a cultural structure, and which psychologically you imbibe and make it part of your daily live.
But
Mm.
isn't it funny? When I did a documentary, we were speaking of Duchamp, and I think it was Richard Dupont who said, Duchamp wasn't swimming in a sea of images. So perhaps in this time where one can reflect upon these steps that you could take to reach nirvana, first of all, what are those steps? And in that time, obviously, you could probably follow those steps a lot easier because there wasn't anything but the stars and the animals.
But there's also another main distinction when the Buddha came upon. He does not believe in the Atman as a autonomous self. In fact,
What year did the Buddha? Do you know? It's,
5 or 600 BC,
yeah, so it's okay.
and he contended that we are not autonomous or individual selves. We just have a fake sense of autonomy because it's rooted in our minds. So he was more like of a psychologist, worried about life's work of deconstructing that mind. And he said you could do it in a lifetime. Well, that's also contended in different schools of Buddhism. But
Right, because reincarnation, or you do it through many lifetimes, and then you reach the human.
but the Zen Buddhism, they open a door to one life's enlightenment. You can sudden enlightenment, which is the satori.
What do you think? So what the Buddha was saying, or he was contending with, is that to separate, there was no such thing as
A Brahman or anything like that.
yeah, or a individual enlightenment. There was a collectively enlightenment.
No. There was an individual enlightenment, and then you could go back and teach other people to find their individuality. The thing is, he wanted to be very clear that he didn't want to have a God in the equation.
Right.
So the Atman Brahman is also very easily interpreted as a dualistic, we're sons of something. So he said, no, we're just individual selves that have a collective sense of identity, which is
Do you think it's an oversoul, like the transcendentalists would then eventually formulate the idea of, like there's an oversoul, and in that oversoul, which would be considered the ocean, our soul is dipping inside of the oversoul, or how do we, differentiate between these two thoughts?
It's funny because when he died, the sects that were fighting over his beliefs constructed a big soul, because you can't have religion without a big
without
guy.
anything. Exactly.
So it's
or even if it's a pool of energy, right? Yeah.
because one thing is to have personal development, enlightenment at the individual sense, and on the other hand, religion and culture and doctrine, which is what you had the day after he died. So where I want to get to is that nevertheless you could still find in India and in other parts of the world that received missionaries or intellectuals or thinkers, you could still work within and delve within this senses of soul and find a much richer variety than we're just sons of God and you have to wait until you die to meet the big guy and he's going to clean you up, whatever you did in life.
But
Or the bad guy, whatever. If you were bad enough, you're just going to fry in hell. And this is a very limited sense of a dualistic identity.
But that came later, right? So Jesus would have to, and it wasn't even Jesus. I mean, do you think that Jesus actually declared himself a son of God? Or do you think that it was the Peter, Paul, and Joseph?
That's a very contentious topic.
Okay,
But
well.
yes, I will answer. I think he was not very much interested in the latter. I mean, he was just, we're all parts of the show.
Yeah.
And we can all spread our love. I mean, what Jesus, or what the interpretation of Jesus in relation to other beliefs is that we're one brotherhood and that love unites us all.
Right, and be meek, be helpful,
And he
be
was more
have
interested
justice.
in the world here.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
He was not interested in
the
the world
far
after.
and far beyond.
But
I mean,
the day he died, the big guy came into the screen, which is the guys working the books, writing the books that he didn't write.
yeah, exactly. That's what I contend with. I mean, and so going back to the self, it is a big question. And then you also add in especially in the Eastern idea of reincarnation, that you have to kind of work through lifetimes upon lifetimes to find some sort of a self that is beyond the projected self. And what's interesting is that pre-Brahman, pre-Buddha, do you think that there was an easier path to separation of, I wonder where mirrors were when people started looking in the mirror, because obviously prior to mirrors, you don't have a projected self. You only have a reflection of yourself, which is a very easy path to a division and a conflict, right? When you finally see yourself, I mean, obviously there was reflection in a mirror, but I don't think the ancients had that reflection possibility.
Well, it's also important to say that the Buddha and the mystical reformation of texts was done in the Iron Age, in which by then you had already writing.
That's 1300s, or when is the Iron Age?
Iron Age starting 1300 in the Middle East,
Yeah.
and it arrived 500 years later in India. So by then you already have written word, language being written down.
Oh, that's an interesting.
It's very important.
Yeah, it's very important to have, because even up to the church, but for a long period of time, the written language was just left for the priests and the nobles.
It was invented by them to give people an identity.
Right, but then they didn't give them the books. It wasn't until the printing press came that, right? Because the church would use painters.
But that was not part of the plan, man.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't need to know. Everybody's going to be told.
We just tell you. It's written
Yes.
here. I'll read it for you.
But the transition is from agriculture, when we identified with the land, we were structuring around rules.
So hunter-gatherer, you're sitting inside a cave trying to get to your Maslow's lowest point of your hierarchy is to find fucking shelter, excuse my language, shelter, food. And once that transition happens, some smart people are evolve and start to see that there's plantation, and they can actually take the fruit of the tree and plant it themselves, find the seed, and then somebody comes along, like we were talking about the guy who first put the pyramid up, and utilizes technology, because there was technology in that sense in the moment.
The most important thing is that the spoken language was developed as a way of identifying the rules we were developing in order to...
So when does that come in? You think it comes in after agriculture? After?
No, the spoken word is before agriculture.
Yeah. So yeah, of course, it would have to be, right? So
yes, much earlier.
So if we have lived, when do we transition from monkeys to humans?
Technically 2 million years ago with...
we started 2 million, beyond Neanderthal falls away.
Australopithecus will be the transition.
And 100,000 years, we start to have cavemen and food.
Yes, technically Homo sapiens.
Homo sapiens start to be formed about 100,000 years ago.
Well, they killed off Neanderthals.
Yeah, killed off Neanderthals.
100,000 years, you're also now having burial practices. You're starting to write. The first art form is scratched in 70,000.
Wow.
For Christ in South Africa. You have graves. You have cave art. Everything happened 100,000 years.
And then up to that evolves up to 75,000. So in that 75,000 years before Venus of Willendorf, and all these sculptures, and if you look, there's a ton of sculptures all over the world at that time, starts to formulate the body, which gives a body identity, and it's mostly women. It's funny that the sculptures are of women.
Well, fertility was
important. Fertility.
And fecundity.
Yeah.
Because you needed a big tribe and a lot of meat on your bones to survive.
Right. Then there was big...
So that's the basic theory. It's not a consensus. Feminists say that was the first manipulation of the human female body, the first Playboy magazine of the time. But it's not really a consensus.
No, but it was also the respect for fertility, and actually, I think it's the opposite. It was there was a lot of cultures that actually hailed their women as the masters of.
But very important, following that, there's no face being engraved.
Right.
It's the body features.
Yeah, it's also.
So they're emphasizing this. This is sort of what the scientists said. And faces well defined. Features don't come until much later in the Bronze Age.
Yeah, which is
4,000 BC.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. So language gets developed in that time between, let's say, 10,000 and 5,000 years. Language is developed, vocal language is developed throughout the 100,000 years formulation, because the people need to communicate. They start to communicate even if it's,
yes.
But
that was horizontal. There was no power structure because people were just referring to the ways of saying, well, who means that and not that. But eventually what you had is a concentration or the establishment of a way of proper
right, the vocalization, the intonation.
And there was a centralization by a few, for example, like singing or chanting and then around the fireplace.
The fireplace, yes.
The myths that were not written, oral practices. Slowly is a transition, very important transition to who we are. So there was a way of singing, for example, in the Rig Veda, to specific gods in order to have their gifts provided, but not everyone can sing it. Just a few specialists. So by that time, you already have a big leap towards the concentration of thought being established by a few.
Right.
And from there to the written word, it's no big leap.
And the written word would come in just, well, obviously alphabet would have to be invented for it to be written down.
No, before that you have
Or-
cuneiform and
Or calligraphy also, right? I mean, in the Asian tradition.
cuneiform would be the first in today's Iraq, Mesopotamia, and you have also the hieroglyphs and the Demotic script in Egypt in the first dynasties. But the most important would be when the Book of the Dead, with written down hieroglyphs, was now made available for not for the masses, but for say what would be the middle and upper classes today, in order for them also to have a good afterlife, like the pharaoh did.
Right.
So originally, the pharaoh was the only one entitled to the magic that the hieroglyphs would bring if they were well sung and read. And slowly, people started gaining access to discourse, written word. And when the Book of the Dead was started to be written down 1600, 1400 BC, you have now people are having access to symbols which now sort of tailor what their lives can be, not only for the afterlife but for their everyday life.
Yeah,
And
because
that's
it's
a very important paradigmatic shift in identity.
why? Because it allows people to form into groups or to follow something that's written.
Because now you have a conceptual mind in the making.
That was my next question.
Yes.
Is that do you think that that's where conceptual
Yes.
thought starts?
No, conceptual thought was before that. Every some you
But
can
even hieroglyphics are
Yes,
conceptual
well,
thought in
even
some
cave
way.
art is an abstract
Yeah,
way
yeah,
of
yeah,
art.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But the condensation of specific ways and concepts that can be introjected and can occupy a space,
Juxtaposed almost.
juxtapose and occupy a semiotic space within your mind as phenomenons that you could reflect upon, doesn't come until you have written symbols, signs
which also create
projected within your mind.
which also create a memory. Like, you can actually go back in your mind and sort of define an experience.
You could go back in your mind. Well, that's a big discussion. I mean, even the defenders of mimetic way of communication say that you have a selective memory mechanism that permits you to be inimical of your own movements.
Oh,
But
it's a physical memory.
It's a physical and it's a phonetic.
Right, okay.
You could go
Oh,
back
phonetic, the way we hear
both.
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's what I'm trying to say. I don't want to complicate things too much. It's much easier to have concepts like written within your mind's walls, like cave art.
Sorry, hold on. Can you just bring it to me? Sorry, that's is radio. Radio, come here. Come here.
It's much more efficient to have an internal conceptual mind,
Sorry about
which
that,
is
guys.
full of symbols. And let me make a very clear example. If you try to look,
Let's take that again. So it's very conceptual mind that's full of
I
symbols.
mean, the conceptual mind is a much larger mind. We need a much bigger brain capacity because we are accumulating lots of concepts now. It's different just to have, very different to have names and phonetics
to say a cow or
Yes,
yeah, exactly.
than to have the cow as a visual image within your mind and then going out there and just projecting all these concepts and not being able to be present without a conceptual framework.
Right, because there's no more abstraction.
There's
It's
no more
always
abstraction.
definition.
It's like a prism.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I mean, perception is mediated by concepts which are being introjected and projected in a retro.
And you think this happens as the Book of Dead is written? This transition sort of starts to happen,
Arguably is.
or it is the
Well, you have hieroglyphics being used before, but not everybody understood them. And now slowly, after the Book of the Dead, and then when the Carthaginians take what we now understand as the alphabet without the vocals to the Greek islands, is when you have the construction of the alphabet that made with Greece is linear B,
Right.
linear A and B, and from there to Rome and Latin and
Well, I mean, let's stop at Greece for a moment, because Greece then starts to define us even further. I think, well, it is through those. I think it's pre-Socrates. There's a few people also. I don't remember the exact names, but they start to formulate further concepts, and then Socrates lands, and then sort of exemplifies a sort of philosophy around these concepts. Or are we, and the myth of the gods is also invented at that time. Is that correct or no? The myth of Zeus and all these gods.
well, Zeus is a later family.
Oh, okay.
You have families prior to Zeus, but
Well, I mean, that's what I mean.
what I'm
Yeah,
trying to
yeah,
say-
yeah. I mean, there's.
when the Iliad and the Odyssey was written,
Oh, right. There you
is
go.
when
Homer.
this family of Zeus and Athena and all the other polytheistic gods were popularized. When people started alphabetizing themselves and gaining access to the written down myths of the Greeks' Iron Age, 800, 900,
BC. Yeah.
it's a later time.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
much later than Egypt. But yes, this is when people started gaining a conceptual understanding that the world they were living was intermediated by gods that were being represented by
Human emotions, really. I mean,
human emotions
exaggerated
and a
human.
power structure that was justifying and legitimizing themselves with these gods in the familiar sense.
It's so fascinating to me, you
Yes.
know. I mean, but you can also say then, I mean, obviously Egyptian culture, Indian culture that was predecessors to the Greek culture had conceptual thought. I mean, why do we consider? I mean, like just the building of that pyramid, which is a monumentously perfectly mathematical structure. All these things probably did require some sort of a conceptual thought.
Obviously.
I mean, and so when we go into the history and the Greeks start to change our focal point, where are we with a sense of identity in these times? Obviously Christ changes everything in the West. Obviously, but also the rise of the Roman Empire, obviously. Where do we find our current basis of identity in those times? What do we attach to the most in the Western world?
Well, Hellas was a collective sense of identity, and the main islands of Hellas, which was Greece, were being dogmatized by similar gods. So when, for example, Sparta or other islands wanted to have an autonomous or independent identity, they would have to construct their own gods.
War is another,
And, war
or
comes from-
land. It goes back to land and concept where people. That's another interesting, right? Because there's a common people. There's a civilization formed. There's a hunter-gatherer to a farmer agricultural. Then philosophical conflicts or the Book of the Dead, which further defines your symbols, and linguistics start to form with the first alphabet with Greece, but then once you form this, obviously people start to feel a little different because they belong to a different.
The main theme there is that now you have anthropomorphic gods, human gods. This is what's supposed to be particular in Greece, and that obviously was different to Egypt, because they would criticize Egypt because of its multi-form gods. You had animals. So it's important to have humans according to the
Right, the
Greeks,
golden cow and the
because then you're justifying your culture around the familiar gods and the gods that you can identify in the emotional and the narrative sense.
right, like the he's angry, but he gets to destroy the whole of this island.
And if people can identify themselves more closely with whatever gods you're selling, then they would follow you more easily.
Right.
So if I have an alligator as a god, then if the alligator doesn't show up, then who am I going to follow?
So you think this power structure obviously happened in many, like you would say, maybe the caste system in India, when it gets developed, this power structure gets developed, and the manipulation of the larger public starts to happen, and utilizing and finding that identity, that self-identity starts to lose to a more collective identity.
Yes, look at the Puranas in India. They come around 1 or 2 centuries after Christ. They're actually copying the format that they saw in the West, whatever we understood as the West. And it's basically a trinity of human gods and narratives, myths, struggles, Mahabharata. You have the Bhagavad Gita. We're all humans.
Right.
And you don't have, even though you have in India polytheism, the main idea of the power structures in India was, well, we need to move slowly into more human gods in order to have a working society. And yeah, the Indian, what they did is they permitted, they were flexible, and they integrated animal gods, but they were levels of gods. If you see the avatars, for example, of Vishnu, the first levels are tadpoles, boars, fish, monkeys, mixtures. But then the last avatars are Krishna, the Buddha, and the one to come, which is the last avatar. But they're more humanized. So where I'm trying to get to is that identity by the time of the Iron Age and thereafter was established around 3 main things: the written word, human gods, and the cyclical linear sense of time. And you give people with that an internal matrix to follow.
So almost like your lifespan, which is a short lifespan at this point, probably.
Well,
like
I'm born in Varanasi. I follow Krishna, and I'm aspiring to die in a liberated way. But that liberation is going to happen in the future. So you structure people around conceptual frameworks of written word and very clear time frames. And that's basically what's after that has been followed by every other power structure in the world. Written word. And
well, now you're at the media, right?
Time structure, which after Christ was linear.
Right.
So it's before the guy and after the guy.
Right. That's
So
when you put a prism or a prison of time where time and space was, it didn't really matter. Another thing that I'm thinking about while we're talking about this is that these parts had the what would later become the Indian or the American Indian or I don't know, what are the people called prior to calling them Indians?
they didn't have a name.
Yeah, I mean, it's just Columbus that called them the Indian. But anyway.
Well, they had their own names for this.
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm saying is that they were also of a tribe mentality, and we were talking about this earlier. This area is known, or all of South America, North America is known for its indigenous people who had a different sense of identity, wouldn't you say? Than because they weren't touched by any of these other forms of
no, but we would also put them in a similar framework. I mean, they had their own gods, many of them didn't have the written word yet, like the Incas or the Aztecs.
Right. How did they communicate?
The Inklings didn't have it very developed.
Zapotecas,
they had
the
simple
Olmecs,
concepts, but it wasn't established alphabet or a complex written mechanism. but nevertheless they had their vocal way of referring to things. And yes, they would write things down, but it was not a generalized sense of technology like we understand it in the alphabetical sense.
Well, I mean, going back to this hour where we said at the outset is that, to make it more personal, it just confuses me a little more. I mean, confuse is probably the wrong word, but, I grew up as I was born in America, but generally people think that where you're born is where your identity is formed, which is something that I wanted to get to, is that does the soul have its own identity, the energy, the vibration, the sense of wonder that when I write a perfect song, or when it floats through me, or that sense of no time, or when I'm making love where there is no time. It's a strange thing is that I've been contending with what part of me is my real me. And it's a big contention, I know. And obviously we live in a schizophrenic age, and I'm a multitasker if there ever was one. I'm a multiple. I am all the things that I want, but as Salinger said in his book, it's in the subtraction a thing is made, not in the addition. So
yes, there is a life force. I agree with that. There is a life force in everything that's animated. There's no doubt about it. It's still a mystery. We don't really know how that life force is kept and maintained.
Yeah.
And many cultures before the power structures that we've been talking about developed refer to in many ways as animistic. Things were animated. The water was animated. Fire was animated. The earth was animated. And but
a tree or
slowly that lost its importance because the construction of culture trumped. Now that the verb is trumped whatever was before, because if I tell you you are as important and as alive as I am, but I want to control you, then I have no power over you. If
right.
we are both
at the
by
same
thing.
Right.
So the invention of gods as intermediaries is a giant step into the creation of a culture that conceptualizes everything and puts everything in hierarchies in order to people to follow them, in order to find whatever sense of identity they are being sold within discourse or social interplay.
But
at any time.
But how is it, Juan Carlos, that you know all this information? Do you fall victim to your own identity reach? I mean, do you ever question what is my own identity? Because I mean, you just did a photo exhibition. You studied international relations or something in college, right? You're undergraduate, and then you did sociology and all of these things. How do you personally, meditate upon, or have you chosen to take a look on what would be your essence?
Yes, and the first part is you have to have a moment of catharsis when you reach a limit and you have a conceptual overload. Because there comes a time when you're reading, traveling, and trying to understand everything, that you have to go the other way of deconstruction. Because in the end, we're all tied up by the same strings.
Right.
That's what I was trying to say. I don't want to put...
Oh, the written word, gods is, yeah.
Every social organization has had God's written word and sense of time as part of the matrix. Which
Sense of time being the biggest at the moment.
Oh yeah, I mean it's Juan is a Mexican name, and I'm at Radio Tulum. It's 6:30.
Right.
It's hard to have a sense of identity in the actual world without those coordinates. So, in order to go beyond that, you first have to have a catharsis of concepts.
Well,
in
forget
order
about going beyond it because we don't even contend going beyond it. I think it's the first. What I'm contending with is you know because of all of my identities, my Indianness, my of Indianness, my own search as a poet or a seeker of love or all of these different identity formations, and now my identity being wrapped up in this place in Radio Tulum or in Bohème, and those separations, I feel like the play I'm working on is first to take a look at my whole path, my whole 9 years of flesh, and even if I have an understanding of 150 years, it still has to be reflected upon to figure out what to drop away,
Well, the thing is, in the end, if you carry too much, it's a big burden. And if you want to have enlightenment or anything short of that, you have to see identity as a provisional attachment. Provisional attachment, which serves a purpose. So yes, it could be important to have. It has been important for the emancipation. Also, not only for forming part, being a member of something, but in the end, if you nowadays, as we will delve later, you have to shed whatever's withholding you if you want to integrate in the global sense.
But
Not even much beyond citizenship.
Yeah, but and that's really jokingly. I said, well, I'm a universal person, not even an earthly person, but it's a question. Like I've been writing this thing and really contending with scenes from my childhood. Uh, you know. Of course, I don't remember being brought to India at 3 months old and dropped off in the lower middle class area of Old Delhi with my grandparents, and I don't remember my mom was with me up to that point. But obviously, I was loved, and I'm told that I would jump into seats on the bus of other people, and then I was charismatic and all of those things, and up to those 10 years of my life, I can see scenes from that, whether it's performance on a stage or singing for the family or doing plays or one act play I think I used to do and jokes and stuff. And then arriving to Boston, which changes my perspective and, all of these things. And obviously, that sense of love. Yeah, please. That sense of love that I gained or wanted access to, because even though I had a lot, I never had that mother's love, which led me to pursue a sort of thesis or sort of a life lived on what was love. And obviously that relates back to India also, because a sense of compassion was there, and becoming a poet in the process after being a big womanizer. Short-lived 3 teenage years of my life. And now dropping America, the one thing I can say is that, I don't really belong, and I choose not to belong to any sect, but I probably do without even realizing it, right? I could, at this moment, use the thing, fuck the audience, and do what you need to do to gain access.
Yes, but you're describing narrative, and that is real, and memories are real. But if I wanted to ask you, can you pinpoint identity in your memory, you would not find it.
There's no, exactly. There is no, but...
And this is a struggle between narrative and identity, which comes from outside. And that's what I told you, when identity is really fluid. It's an open-ended process. It's a construction. in process.
And then if it's a construction and it's a narrative, then in order to write something, right, there's a character that I've been playing with which wants to write something that will open up the minds and heart. Of course, it's an absurdist idea, and that's why I've given this to this character of this. It's a Walt Whitman like path that he chooses. Where Walt thought that all of Civil War wouldn't happen because he wrote Leaves of Grass, but he knew that he saw all humans, and it enlightened him. It made him wonder if by seeing how different we are, how identity isn't meshed up in a collective mess, that we can have an identity for ourselves,
Yes.
in some sort of peaceful way rather than a conflicted way, And as an artist, and I've given him this character, this idea, because I want to get to some sort of a truth, right? When identity is fluid, it is the amalgamation of all your narrative examination, maybe.
But to get there, good point. To get there, I mean, let me be clear. There can be an individual sense of identity, but it's always going to be enmeshed with some collective concepts and senses of identity. But what I'm trying to say is that even though we were dogmatized and indoctrinated by symbols and concepts and written words, we could still use them to give our lives meaning in the world. So
is that what it boils down to? Is that it boiled down to is meaning?
It boils down
is that
to
what
finding meaning beyond a collective sense of self, and using whatever's good for your not only survival, but for your transcendence as a human being. So you don't want to break away and climb the mountain like Nietzsche or Buddha at his initial stages. But
goddamn Nietzsche.
You don't bring down the buildings. You use what's there, see it as a technology that can help your narrative succeed within an individual.
Yeah, but I think you're talking
collective
about.
sense of identity.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think you're talking about the common man, the more societal man, and whereas I am talking about the Nietzsche, I am talking about this Kubrick, I am talking about that singularity of purpose and vision, that we, and we'll get into the second hour about nationalists, that we need as a human race, because without those singularity of vision, nothing will ever change.
But
because
what they did is that they reframed and reshaped
what was there.
what was there and the concepts they were given, and they took whatever they needed in order to present art or expressions that could be understood by the common man that was within.
But I
collective
don't
sense
think
of
they
identity.
cared about the. I mean, as much as they cared. I mean, know that Buddha cared, or Christ cared, but their singularity, or Einstein trying to figure out, a formula. It's sort of a clearing of the path. It's like Moses clearing the sea, and looking at what's underneath it. It's almost. I talk about that because it's such an important struggle, and I guess I am meshed. I could never, as Krishna says to Arjuna, when Arjuna says, "But I don't want to fight," and he says, "Well, you can complain and how much ever you want, but you're a warrior and you'll continue to fight." So I am meshed within that thought of my participation in the human condition, which will never change, but my singularity conflict of delivering something for myself, which has been profoundly searched through, and if sharing that truth, whether it is taken or not taken, doesn't matter. I think it was my girlfriend Marie yesterday who said also about when you, and I said this a long time ago, when you create something, you give it to the world, and whether they take it or don't take it, it doesn't really matter. But to know that you've delivered, know that you have created something for your own truth that goes beyond just the 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 path that has been given you. You know, you're kind of rolling around in this life, and you're grabbing identities. You plop yourself down. You buy a little thing, or they take away the hotel. So I start Radio Tulum. I always had Radio Mandeep. It's like we're plopping, and all of a sudden, there's no assimilation of the accumulation. So I mean, I speak of. I think giving life purpose is also a misnomer. What happens if there's nothing beyond? Why are we giving this life purpose? Because somebody would argue
It's what
that
we
this
have.
exactly that's the only thing we can have to be happy, because the world's identity that it gives us, makes us feel what old people have no fucking place in this society. And growing old, you might as well go into the corner. Aside
It's okay.
aside from going to die in a corner, aside from this civilization or Indian civilization, and I just heard, we're going to talk about Burma in the next hour, but elders are respected, but most of the time, if you want to grow old well, and if you want to have, the only thing you can have is purpose. But really, some would say,
But
what the fuck
purpose-
for?
but
Do
purpose,
do drugs, hang out, party, have sex. I mean, and then you get into the STD. I mean, it's like such a
In order to be understood, every narrative has to use a common language. So,
well. That's an interesting point. But isn't the common language now the American consumer capitalistic?
No, I didn't mean that. No, that's not. That's a deviation. Common language means that you're using a way of communication that has been given, and that you're not planning in reforming it completely, because the limits of your perception are the limits of your language.
Of course.
So,
or how much you've learned that language to be able to express yourself.
so one foot has to be inside the system, and if you want your narrative to stand out, one has to be outside. One foot has to be outside of the system. So if not, you're going to be isolated, like many writers or artists we didn't know about because they were so isolated, we never heard about them.
Yeah.
So even though we're within the matrix, we take it to its limits in order to be understood. So I want to bring this to a close. by
Oh. Don't bring it too close. I'm still fucking confused.
saying- no,
I'm kidding. I'm
yeah,
joking.
it's a paradox. It's a paradox because, sometimes we are neurotic because we don't know what to do with all the concepts that are drowning us
Schizophrenic
into
too.
oblivion. But nevertheless, we use and cut, trim, deconstruct,
Trim,
deconstruct,
subtract.
whatever, subtract, separate whatever we need to be happy and to fulfill our narrative, in order to make it transcend and not only swim around whatever conceptual framework we are living with. So I didn't
Well,
come
you-
here to answer the Pandora's box.
No.
the
But what
riddles.
about you as a personal? Have you are you on the process of transcending your own identifiers?
I'm just a sack of bones.
Just a sack of bones,
No,
just
but
a piece
yes,
of flesh.
I am.
You're much more beyond that, Juan Carlos.
I
We
am
know
in-
that.
I am interested in sharing the conceptual trimming that I found necessary in order to understand the conceptual overload we're in, and trying to share a way of finding solace and finding a way out,
Contentment, yeah.
contentment, within, because if you look at the world today, the postmodern world, the mediatic, the informatical, cybernetical revolutions have not made life easier. I mean, we have much more concepts to dwell upon, and that can create madness. So, yeah, I've gone through madness in order to
That's
present
exactly my
a
point.
few proposals, expressions of my own individual take on my own individual weaving of identity, more tilted towards the narrative sense, in order not to be drowned by all the collective
Homogenization.
homogenization and requirements of the nation, of social class, of party, of affiliations, whatever, which can be overwhelming to the common man, common humans.
It's interesting. Also, I think it has a lot. Also, I would add that your vast research, it's an important facet to in some degree. Although this new guy on the block, Satguru, would tell you that all the answers are floating in your consciousness. I have no idea how to gain access. Maybe the meditation will lead me there, but also I think there's another path, is through research and knowledge of all of this identifiers that have existed, and that historical sense is quite important in today's world. A personal historical sense, you have to go back and evaluate. And funnily, I read Juan Carlos, the opening of the play, where one of the characters says most people would have to jump into the abyss, go mad, traverse the depth of the ocean, but most people, and that's the issue, most people don't have the wherewithal. They either work too much or whatever the reasons are, they would rather sit on their couch and not go that path. And that's why there has to exist men and women that further that concept, that give the advice. The funny thing is that the marketing and the swindlers, which we're going to get into in the next hour, they have formulated concepts and equations now to hold us in place also, which is in many ways, I think, that not only hold us, but to formulate our identities as if they were cemented, so to speak. But anyway, this has been an interesting hour. Have we been in an hour already, Marie? Oh, wow.
Can I close just by saying?
Yeah.
In order to discover, to comprehend, you first have to go through the understanding the constraints and knowing what's there for us to keep us away from being ourselves, and to really get to the point of not knowing, which is the path to liberation.
Nothingness, as Krishnamurti
You
would
have
put
to
it.
know.
Yeah.
So the mind is not just a block obstructing. It is a stage. It is
Like the Buddha would have you believe.
yes. You first have to.
Desire is important in certain. You have to, in order to get to know
You have
desire.
to follow,
Yeah.
accumulate. You have
Yeah.
to know. You have to test, and then you have to. Once you see that, and it's not giving you the answers in the transcendental sense you need, you can then see it after its crisis from outside, from beyond, and then just see it as a stepping stone to not knowing, which is this emptiness. It's not really empty, it's full of knowing, but it
it's
also
assimilation.
gives you perspective
Yeah.
that you can then play around with and say, well, I'm just mind during the day. And at nighttime, I am in madness. And madness.
Win
and
me or lose
mind,
me.
Madness mind, the mad mind can help me to make my narrative persist and survive and transcend the individual concepts that overload whatever narrative or individual sense of identity I could play around with in my short lifetime.
Wow, amazing. Well put. I think create a creative force to develop something,
Create
to create. And that's really what it is. It's a
forcefully.
yeah, and you have to, it's a force. It's a progressive. It's an independent voice. It's Radio Tulum. Hear the love in all that you do. This is the first hour.
Gracias.
We'll be right back with the next hour where we're going to contend with where we're at as a communal society and all the changes that have been occurring. So stay tuned for episode 10 coming up. Just let's take a 5 minute break. Bravo, gentlemen. And Jimmy, were you the one screaming in the middle of that? Maybe you want to do the hour tomorrow? Oh, you're just getting warmed up. Take a little break. Keep going. Juan Carlos Guerra. We have our own Eduardo Galeano here with us.
That's a big comment. Thank you.
We are doing the rehearsal after the movie. Keep recording what you're recording. Beautiful.
Thank you, man.
All right, let's do it. You want to take a bathroom break?
Yeah, I have to pee pee.